My beloved child, something shifted the moment those words were spoken, and strangely, it was not because your soulmate heard something terrible about you. It was because the third party finally said something they had been holding back for longer than anyone realized, something your soulmate had never expected to hear from that particular person, and for several quiet seconds, there was no response at all. Just silence. The kind of silence that comes when a familiar story suddenly stops making sense. Your soulmate had entered that conversation believing they already understood where everyone stood. They thought they knew what the third party believed about you. They thought they knew what would be said if your name ever entered the room. But this time, the conversation moved differently. One sentence changed its direction completely, and what happened afterward has left your soulmate looking at you, the past, and even their own decisions through a different lens. Don't skip, because the most important part is not simply what the third party said. It is why they chose to say it now. There had been small signs leading toward this moment, although nobody recognized them at first. A hesitation whenever your name appeared. A conversation that suddenly became quieter. A question your soulmate asked casually but never received a complete answer to. The third party had noticed things they did not want to admit they had noticed. They had watched the way your soulmate changed whenever you were mentioned. They had seen how certain memories involving you refused to disappear. They had even begun noticing something about you that challenged the version of you they once carried in their mind. And that realization created an uncomfortable question: what if they had misunderstood you? That question stayed with them much longer than they expected. It followed them through ordinary moments. It returned whenever someone mentioned loyalty, sincerity, or the kind of connection that survives silence. Eventually, pretending not to notice became harder than acknowledging what was happening. Then came the conversation. It began innocently enough. Your soulmate was not demanding answers. Nobody was planning some dramatic confession. Your name surfaced naturally, almost accidentally, and for a moment the third party could have changed the subject. They almost did. Your soulmate noticed it: the pause, the glance away, the strange softness that replaced their usual certainty. And then the third party said something unexpected: there is something about them you should probably know. Your soulmate immediately became still. Not frightened. Not angry. Simply alert. Because those words sounded different from anything the third party had said before. There was no accusation behind them. No attempt to influence. There was something closer to reluctant honesty. Your soulmate asked what they meant, but the third party hesitated again, as though deciding whether saying the truth would change more than they were prepared for. And perhaps they already knew it would. Something important is waiting for you here, because what came next was not a secret about something you had done. It was an admission about something the third party had finally understood. They told your soulmate that they had been watching this connection from the outside for a long time, and somewhere along the way they had started seeing a pattern they could no longer dismiss. Whenever your soulmate tried to emotionally move away from you, something pulled their attention back, not because you were chasing them, not because you were forcing anything, but because certain feelings remained unresolved. Certain memories still carried weight. Certain questions about you had never truly been answered. The third party had once interpreted this as confusion. Now they were beginning to see something else. They had noticed that your soulmate did not speak about you the way people speak about something meaningless. Even when your soulmate tried to sound detached, there was always a subtle change. A pause before your name. A careful choice of words. A strange instinct to defend details about you that nobody had even criticized. And perhaps most revealing of all, your soulmate remembered the smallest things. A sentence you once said. A preference you casually mentioned. A moment that should have faded but somehow remained vivid. The third party had noticed every one of those details. What they admitted next was simple, but it landed heavily. I think I underestimated what this person means to you. Your soulmate did not answer immediately. How could they? Sometimes another person speaks aloud the truth we have been quietly avoiding, and suddenly there is nowhere for that truth to hide. Your soulmate looked away for a moment, and the third party could see that something had reached them. Not because the sentence introduced a new feeling, but because it gave language to one that had already been living beneath the surface. And then another unexpected thing happened. Instead of stopping there, the third party continued. They admitted that there had been moments when they judged you without fully understanding you. Moments when they formed conclusions from fragments rather than the complete picture. They had heard certain things, interpreted certain silences, and assumed they knew your intentions. But time had complicated those assumptions. Your behavior had not matched the story they expected. You did not react the way they assumed you would. You did not constantly push for attention. You did not need to prove yourself every moment. In fact, there were times when your restraint spoke louder than anything you could have said. Stay till the end, because that detail became the turning point. The third party had expected your absence to make your soulmate forget. Instead, your absence sometimes made your presence clearer. They had expected distance to simplify everything. Instead, distance exposed what had remained unfinished. They had expected your soulmate to eventually speak about you with indifference. But the opposite happened in subtle ways. Your soulmate became more reflective. Certain conversations affected them differently. Certain songs, places, ordinary moments, even random phrases seemed to bring some hidden thought back to the surface. The third party did not understand it at first. Then slowly, quietly, they began connecting those moments. And once they connected them, they could not ignore the conclusion. Your soulmate had never fully stopped wondering about you. That was when the conversation became more personal. The third party asked a question your soulmate was not prepared for. If you could speak to them right now without pride, confusion, or anyone else's opinion involved, what would you actually say? The room seemed to change after that. Your soulmate tried to answer quickly, almost automatically, but the words did not come. Because the easy answers were suddenly unavailable. Saying nothing would not have been honest. Saying, I don't care anymore, would not have matched what the third party had witnessed. And pretending everything had been forgotten would have required ignoring too many quiet truths. So your soulmate sat with the question. What would they say to you if nobody else were listening? What would they admit if they did not have to protect themselves from vulnerability? What part of the story would they finally explain? There was a moment small, almost invisible when your soulmate's expression softened. And that was when the third party realized their words had reached somewhere deeper than expected. Your soulmate finally said, I would ask if they ever understood why I became distant. Notice that. They did not say they would ask whether you missed them. They did not ask whether you still cared. Their first thought was whether you understood their silence. That single sentence revealed something the third party had never known. Your soulmate had been carrying their own version of the story too. A version filled with hesitation, uncertainty, and things that were never properly explained. Perhaps there were moments when you interpreted distance as lack of feeling, while your soulmate experienced that same distance as a way of sorting through feelings they did not yet know how to express. Perhaps both of you stood on opposite sides of the same silence, each assuming the other understood more than they actually did. And suddenly the third party was no longer speaking about you. They were listening. Your soulmate began revealing small pieces, not everything, not yet, but enough to make one thing clear: this connection had affected them more deeply than they had ever admitted publicly. They spoke about one memory involving you that had stayed unusually vivid. It was not necessarily some grand romantic scene. In fact, that was what made it powerful. It was ordinary. Something you said when you probably did not realize they were paying such close attention. Something kind. Something sincere. Something that made them feel understood at a moment when they had been quietly struggling with their own thoughts. Your soulmate remembered the exact feeling of that moment. And when they described it, the third party realized something else: you had become associated in your soulmate's mind with a kind of emotional familiarity that was difficult to replace. Not perfection. Not fantasy. Familiarity. The sense that somehow, even when things became complicated, part of your soulmate still recognized something real in you. That revelation changed the third party's tone completely. They stopped questioning why your soulmate still thought about you and began asking what had prevented them from being honest about it. Your soulmate gave no immediate answer. Instead, they looked toward their phone. That tiny movement mattered more than anyone said. Your name was not necessarily on the screen. No message had suddenly arrived. But for one quiet second, your soulmate seemed tempted to do something they had postponed again and again. Reach out. Write something. Reopen a conversation. Say the sentence they had rehearsed privately but never sent. Their hand moved closer to the phone, then stopped. The third party noticed. You still want to talk to them, don't you? They asked. Your soulmate gave a faint smile, the kind people give when they have been understood too accurately. There are things I should have said differently, they replied. And there it was. Not a dramatic declaration. Not some impossible promise. Something more believable, and perhaps more meaningful: recognition. Your soulmate was beginning to recognize that the story between you might not be exactly what they had told themselves it was. They were remembering moments differently. Reconsidering assumptions. Wondering whether silence had created conclusions that neither of you intended. And the person who unexpectedly opened that door was the very third party your soulmate never expected to defend your place in their heart. But there is another layer to this, and this is where everything truly began to change. The third party had not brought up your name merely because they noticed your soulmate still cared. They had recently learned something about you, something small enough to sound unimportant at first, yet meaningful enough to challenge a long-held assumption. Your soulmate immediately sensed there was more. What did you hear? they asked. The third party paused. They could have answered immediately. Instead, they chose their words carefully. Because this detail was connected to a moment from the past that your soulmate had misunderstood completely. Something you once did or perhaps chose not to do had been interpreted one way when the truth behind it was very different. And suddenly, your soulmate realized the conversation was no longer about whether you mattered. That question was already answering itself. Now the question was whether something they believed about you had been wrong from the beginning. Your soulmate leaned closer. The third party lowered their voice and said, "I found out why they really stayed quiet that day." And that is where the entire meaning of the past began to shift, because the reason had nothing to do with what your soulmate had assumed. The truth was quieter than your soulmate expected, and that was exactly why it struck so deeply. The third party did not reveal some dramatic secret or impossible twist. They revealed a detail that had been sitting unnoticed inside the past, changing the meaning of everything around it. That day your soulmate had believed you were deliberately withdrawing. They had interpreted your silence as indifference, perhaps even as proof that you had already made your choice. What they never knew was that you had stepped back because you sensed they were overwhelmed. You had noticed something in their behavior: the shorter replies, the distracted energy, the way they seemed emotionally stretched, and instead of demanding reassurance from them, you gave them room. You thought you were protecting the connection from unnecessary pressure. Your soulmate thought you were letting it go. Two completely different meanings had been living inside the same silence. For several seconds, your soulmate simply stared at the third party. "How do you know that?" they finally asked. That question carried more emotion than the words themselves suggested, because something inside them was already rearranging old memories. The third party explained that they had recently heard something from someone who had been closer to the situation than either of them realized. Your name had surfaced unexpectedly, and during that conversation, a small truth came out: you had apparently been worried about becoming another burden in your soulmate's life during an already complicated time. You had wondered whether reaching out too much would make things harder for them. So you chose restraint. Not because you felt nothing, but because you felt enough to consider what they might need. Your soulmate lowered their eyes. Suddenly, one of the most painful misunderstandings between you looked completely different. The silence they had taken personally may never have been personal at all. And that realization opened another memory. A message you had once sent. Short. Simple. Almost ordinary. At the time, your soulmate had read it quickly and assumed there was little emotion behind it. Now they remembered the exact wording differently. There had been warmth inside it. There had been patience. There had even been an opening for them to speak honestly if they wanted to. But because they were already convinced you were moving away, they had read the message through that assumption. Isn't it strange how one belief can change the meaning of every word that follows it? Your soulmate began wondering how many moments between you had been filtered through misunderstandings neither of you ever stopped to question. The third party could see it happening. One memory became another. One unanswered question created two more. Your soulmate remembered a time you changed the subject when something emotional came up. They had thought you were avoiding depth. Now they wondered whether you had sensed they were uncomfortable and were trying to protect them from being pushed too far. They remembered another moment when you did not ask where they had been or why they had disappeared for a while. At the time, they interpreted that as lack of interest. Now they wondered whether you were simply respecting their boundaries. Suddenly the very qualities they had misunderstood began looking different. Your quietness looked less like distance and more like patience. Your restraint looked less like uncertainty and more like consideration. Even your absence began to carry another possibility. Maybe you had not disappeared because you stopped caring. Maybe you had simply stopped trying to force clarity from someone who was not ready to give it. Don't skip, because the third party had one more observation, and this one reached somewhere your soulmate had been protecting for a long time. You keep remembering what they didn't do, the third party said, but have you ever thought about everything they chose not to demand from you? Your soulmate became completely still. That sentence was different. It asked them to look at you not through the moments where they felt uncertain, but through everything you could have done and chose not to do. You could have demanded explanations. You could have insisted they make decisions before they were ready. You could have filled every silence with questions. You could have turned your disappointment into pressure. But there had been moments when you simply stepped back. You let them breathe. You carried questions privately because you did not want every emotion to become another weight on their shoulders. Your soulmate had once interpreted that as emotional distance. Now they were beginning to understand that sometimes care does not arrive loudly. Sometimes care looks like giving someone space without punishing them for needing it. Sometimes it looks like refusing to turn affection into a negotiation. Sometimes it is the message that was never sent because you knew sending it in that moment would make things more complicated. Your soulmate leaned back slowly, and the third party noticed something in their expression they had not seen before. Regret was there, but not the heavy kind that closes a person down. This regret seemed to be opening something. It was the realization that perhaps your soulmate had spent too much time asking, why didn't they come closer, and not enough time asking, what might they have been trying to protect. That question changed the emotional shape of the conversation. Suddenly, your soulmate wanted details. They wanted to know exactly what had been said about you. They wanted to know who had mentioned that old moment and why it was coming up now. The third party answered carefully. Apparently, someone remembered speaking with you around that period. They remembered you saying something surprisingly simple: you did not want your soulmate to feel pressured to choose anything because of you. You wanted whatever happened between you to happen naturally. When those words were repeated, your soulmate looked toward the floor. Their reaction was subtle, but unmistakable. Because those words sounded like you. Not the version of you they had built during confused moments. Not the version others may have described. You. The person they had actually known in the quiet spaces between everything complicated. Stay till the end, because this is where the third party unexpectedly admitted their own mistake. I used to think your connection with them was mostly unfinished emotion, they said. Now I think maybe it stayed unfinished because neither of you ever understood what the other was protecting. Your soulmate looked up quickly. That sentence landed differently. It did not promise destiny. It did not claim everything would suddenly become perfect. It simply introduced a possibility your soulmate had never seriously considered. Maybe the distance between you was not created by lack of feeling. Maybe it was created by two people responding to uncertainty in opposite ways. You became quieter because you did not want to pressure them. They became quieter because they interpreted your restraint as withdrawal. You waited for clarity because you wanted honesty. They waited for certainty because they were afraid of reading you incorrectly. And while both of you waited, silence slowly began writing a story neither of you had actually chosen. Your soulmate suddenly laughed softly, not because anything was funny, but because sometimes realization arrives with a strange disbelief. "So we might have both been waiting for the other person?" they asked. The third party gave no dramatic answer. They simply said, "Maybe." That one word opened more space than any certainty could have. Your soulmate reached for their phone again. This time they actually unlocked it. The third party said nothing. They watched as your soulmate moved through the screen, paused, then stopped somewhere familiar. Your conversation. Perhaps old. Perhaps quiet. Perhaps buried beneath months of ordinary messages and everyday distractions. Your soulmate did not type immediately. Instead, they scrolled. A sentence from you appeared. Then another. And with the new context surrounding them, those old words seemed different. There was one message where you had said something along the lines of taking whatever time they needed. Your soulmate had once considered it almost final, as though you were preparing to disappear. Now they saw tenderness in it. There was another where you wished them well without asking anything in return. At the time, they had wondered why you sounded so calm. Now they realized calmness did not necessarily mean you were unaffected. Perhaps you had simply chosen not to place your emotional weight on them. Your soulmate stopped scrolling. Their finger remained over the screen while something inside them softened. "I read all of this wrong," they whispered. The third party did not correct them or reassure them. They simply allowed the moment to breathe. Because this was not about blaming your soulmate for misunderstanding you. People interpret situations through whatever emotions they are carrying at the time. If someone already fears being left, even patience can look like distance. If someone expects disappointment, even kindness can seem temporary. Your soulmate was beginning to see that their interpretation had been shaped by fears and uncertainties you may never have known existed. And then the third party asked another question, one that shifted the entire conversation again. What if they misunderstood you too? Your soulmate looked up. That possibility had somehow been missing from every previous reflection. They had been thinking about what they misunderstood about you, but suddenly they wondered what you might have misunderstood about them. Their silence. Their delays. Their moments of hesitation. Their inability to say what they were feeling when the opportunity was right in front of them. Had you interpreted those things as rejection? Had you believed you were unwanted when they were actually confused? Had you assumed they were emotionally unaffected because they did not know how to communicate what was happening inside them? The possibility unsettled them in the gentlest way. Because it meant you might be carrying an incomplete story too. They probably think I didn't care, your soulmate said quietly. The third party asked, "Did you?" Your soulmate did not answer immediately. They looked again at the old messages on their phone. Then they said something the third party had never heard from them before. "I cared more than I knew what to do with." There it was. Not a perfect confession. Not a promise about tomorrow. Just an honest sentence that finally gave shape to the silence. Your soulmate admitted that caring had made everything feel more complicated, not less. When something matters only a little, people can sometimes speak freely because there is little to lose. But when something matters deeply, every word can begin to feel consequential. What if they said too much? What if you did not feel the same way? What if speaking honestly changed the comfortable parts of your connection forever? What if they chose the wrong moment? Those questions had delayed them repeatedly. And each delay had probably looked to you like another answer. Something important is waiting for you, because after hearing that, the third party stopped being an observer and became strangely reflective. They admitted they had contributed, even unintentionally, to some of the confusion. There had been moments when your soulmate asked for their perspective, and instead of encouraging direct communication, the third party offered interpretations. They tried to decode your behavior from the outside. They told your soulmate what your silence probably meant. They suggested reasons for your distance without actually knowing your heart. None of it had necessarily been malicious. Sometimes people interfere simply because they think they are helping. But now the third party understood something important. They had been filling unknown spaces with assumptions, and your soulmate had sometimes treated those assumptions as facts. I should have told you to ask them yourself, the third party admitted. Your soulmate's face changed slightly. That admission mattered because it removed another layer between you. Maybe the story had become complicated not only because neither of you spoke clearly enough, but because too many interpretations entered the space where direct communication should have been. Advice. Opinions. Guesses. Assumptions. Everyone trying to explain what two people were feeling without those two people actually sitting together and saying it. Your soulmate finally closed the old conversation on their phone. For a moment, you might assume that meant they had decided not to reach out. But then they opened a blank message instead. Their fingers hovered above the keyboard. They typed several words. Deleted them. Typed again. Deleted everything. The third party smiled slightly. Still overthinking? They asked. Your soulmate almost smiled back. I don't know where to begin. And that was perhaps the most honest place they could begin from. Because how do you reopen something after so much silence without pretending the silence never happened? How do you acknowledge misunderstanding without turning the conversation into blame? How do you say, I see something differently now, without demanding that the other person immediately meet you in the same place? Your soulmate knew one careless message could reopen old confusion. So they did something unexpected. They put the phone down. Not because they changed their mind, but because they wanted the first honest conversation between you to come from clarity rather than impulse. That decision surprised the third party. They had expected your soulmate to react immediately after everything they had learned. Instead, your soulmate chose patience, the very thing they were finally beginning to recognize in you. Later that evening, long after the conversation had ended, your soulmate found themselves returning to one particular memory. It was a moment when you had looked at them as though you wanted to say something but decided against it. They had noticed it then. They had wondered about it afterward. But they never asked. Now that moment seemed almost luminous in their memory. What had you wanted to say? Had you been waiting for some sign that it was safe to speak honestly? Had you changed your mind because their expression seemed distant? Had one tiny moment altered the direction of everything that followed? Your soulmate replayed it several times, noticing details they had forgotten. The way you paused. The slight shift in your voice afterward. The fact that you became more careful around them from that point on. Suddenly they wondered whether there had been a moment when you were ready to open the door, and they had unknowingly closed it. The thought did not make them hopeless. Strangely, it made them curious. Because if something could be misunderstood once, perhaps it could also be understood differently now. And this is where the third party's words began affecting more than your soulmate's memories. They began affecting their next choices. The next morning, your soulmate did something small but unusual. They looked for something connected to you, not necessarily your profile, not necessarily a message, but something that brought your presence back into focus. Perhaps an old photograph. Perhaps a saved note. Perhaps a place the two of you had once talked about. They were not searching for proof of anything. They were trying to understand their own emotional response without anyone else interpreting it for them. And what they noticed surprised them. Thinking about you did not bring only sadness or confusion. Beneath those things was warmth. Familiarity. Even a sense of peace connected to certain memories. That mattered. Because they had spent so long thinking the connection itself was the source of their uncertainty that they had never considered another possibility. Maybe the uncertainty came from how they handled the connection, not from the connection itself. That distinction changed something. Your soulmate began separating you from the misunderstanding surrounding you. You were not the silence. You were not the opinions. You were not the assumptions that accumulated during the distance. You were the actual person behind all of that. And once your soulmate began seeing the difference, they remembered things about you they had nearly forgotten. The way you listened when they spoke about something important. The way you noticed changes in their mood even when they tried to hide them. The way your humor appeared at unexpected moments. The way conversations with you sometimes continued in their mind long after they ended. Tiny details. Nothing dramatic. Yet together those details formed something much harder to dismiss than any grand declaration. They formed emotional reality. But one question remained. Why had the third party chosen now to tell them all of this? Why after so much time? Why after allowing certain assumptions to remain unchallenged? Your soulmate eventually asked exactly that. And the third party's answer was not what they expected. Because I saw something yesterday, they said. Your soulmate's attention sharpened immediately. What? The third party hesitated, and for the first time in the conversation, they seemed genuinely uncertain about how much they should reveal. They explained that they had seen or heard something involving you, something completely ordinary on the surface, but it changed the way they understood your side of the story. It was not evidence of some hidden plan. It was not gossip. It was a small moment of sincerity that you probably never expected anyone connected to your soulmate to notice. The third party had watched you respond to a situation in a way that revealed something about your character. There had been no audience you were trying to impress. No reason for you to perform kindness or loyalty. You simply acted naturally. And that was precisely what affected them. They realized the version of you they had carried in their mind did not match the person they had quietly observed. Your soulmate leaned forward. What did they do? They asked. The third party looked at them for a long moment. Then they said, "That's the part one think you need to hear carefully, because once I saw it, I understood why you never really forgot them." And what they revealed next would not only change how your soulmate remembered you, it would force them to reconsider the single decision that had created the greatest distance between you. What the third party witnessed would have looked insignificant to almost anyone else, yet somehow it answered the question your soulmate had been carrying for months. There had been a moment when someone mentioned your soulmate in your presence without realizing how carefully you were listening. Nothing dramatic happened. You did not rush to defend yourself, reveal private details, or try to control the conversation. Instead, when the discussion began moving toward assumptions about your soulmate, you quietly stopped it from going further. You could have used the opportunity to explain your side. You could have exposed every misunderstanding and made yourself look better. But you did not. You simply said that people should not judge someone from fragments of a story they never fully lived through. Then you changed the subject. That was all. Yet the third party could not forget it. They had expected that if you still carried disappointment, you might speak differently when your soulmate was not there to hear you. They expected frustration, perhaps a little bitterness, perhaps some need to prove that you had been treated unfairly. Instead, you protected the dignity of someone who was not even in the room. You protected your soulmate without knowing that anyone connected to them was paying attention. And that single ordinary moment broke something open inside the third party. Suddenly they understood that your restraint in the past may not have been emotional weakness or indifference. It may have been character. It may have been your way of refusing to turn private feelings into public conflict. Your soulmate listened without interrupting. Something about the story reached them immediately because they recognized the behavior. They had seen that side of you before. There were moments when you could have embarrassed them but chose not to. Moments when you knew more than you said. Moments when you had every opportunity to demand an explanation and instead chose patience. At the time, your soulmate had not connected those moments. Now they were beginning to form a pattern. "They really said that?" your soulmate asked quietly. The third party nodded. "They didn't know I was listening." That detail changed everything. Because sincerity carries a different weight when there is no audience. Your soulmate looked away, and suddenly another old memory returned. There had once been a disagreement between the two of you. Nothing enormous, but enough to leave both of you unsettled. Later, your soulmate discovered that someone close to you knew almost nothing about it. At the time, they had wondered why you had kept everything so private. They assumed perhaps the situation did not matter enough for you to discuss. Now they considered another possibility. Maybe you simply did not want other people deciding who your soulmate was based on one difficult moment. Maybe you had protected the connection even while you were confused by it. That realization created an unexpected softness in them. Don't skip, because your soulmate then remembered the decision that had created the greatest distance between you, and for the first time they questioned whether it had been made from truth or from fear. There had been a moment when your soulmate deliberately pulled away. Perhaps they responded less. Perhaps they stopped initiating conversations. Perhaps they convinced themselves that stepping back permanently would make everything simpler. They told themselves you would probably be happier without the uncertainty. They told themselves that if you truly wanted them, you would somehow cross the distance they had created. But beneath those explanations lived a quieter reason they rarely admitted: your soulmate was afraid of discovering exactly how much you mattered. Distance gave them the illusion of control. If they never asked the difficult question, they would never hear an answer they were not ready for. If they remained uncertain, they could continue imagining every possibility. But honest conversation would require courage, and at that time, courage was the one thing they did not know how to offer. The third party knew something about that period too. They had watched your soulmate pretend the distance was helping while becoming strangely restless whenever your name surfaced. They remembered your soulmate checking their phone after conversations ended. They remembered how quickly their attention changed whenever someone mentioned something connected to you. They remembered one evening when your soulmate casually asked whether you seemed happy lately, then immediately tried to make the question sound unimportant. None of those moments made sense then. Now they did. Your soulmate had not moved away emotionally as completely as they moved away physically. The third party finally said what they had been thinking: maybe you didn't leave because you stopped caring. Maybe you left because caring made you feel exposed. Your soulmate did not deny it. That silence was its own answer. Something important is waiting for you, because the conversation then moved away from the past and toward what your soulmate might do now. The third party did not tell them to contact you immediately. They did not promise everything would work out. Instead, they asked something far more difficult: if you never speak honestly to them, are you comfortable letting them remember you through a misunderstanding? Your soulmate looked at their phone again. That question followed them deeper than any advice could have. Until that moment, reaching out had felt like a question of whether the connection should continue. Now they saw another reason for speaking: perhaps honesty mattered even without knowing the outcome. Maybe there were things you deserved to understand. Maybe your soulmate did not need a perfect plan for the future before admitting what had been true in the past. Maybe they could simply tell you, "I was more affected than I knew how to show." That possibility felt different. It removed the pressure of solving everything at once. It allowed one honest conversation to be just that, honest. Your soulmate began imagining how you might receive such words. Would you be surprised? Would you believe them? Would you remember the same moments differently? They knew they could not control your response, and strangely, that realization gave them clarity. For so long, they had avoided speaking because they wanted certainty first. Certainty that you still cared. Certainty that you would understand. Certainty that opening the door would not lead to another misunderstanding. Now they recognize that emotional honesty rarely arrives with guarantees. Sometimes it simply requires saying what is true and allowing another person the freedom to decide what that truth means to them. Later that day, your soulmate returned to the unfinished message they had started. This time they did not begin with something dramatic. They did not write a long explanation. They wrote one sentence: "There is something I think I understood too late." They stared at it. Deleted it. Tried again. "I've been thinking differently about something that happened between us. Better, but still not right." Deleted again. Then another sentence appeared: I may have misunderstood why you became quiet. Your soulmate stopped. That one felt closer. It was vulnerable without being overwhelming. Honest without demanding anything from you. Yet they still did not send it. Not yet. They wanted to understand one more thing first. They contacted the third party again and asked exactly what had been said in that conversation where you defended them. The third party repeated the words as accurately as they could. Your soulmate listened carefully, then asked, "Did they seem upset when they said it?" The answer surprised them. No. They seemed peaceful. Peaceful. That word stayed with your soulmate. They had imagined you carrying resentment. They had imagined that perhaps you wanted them to feel guilty. They had imagined so many emotional versions of you because they had never asked which one was real. But if you could speak about them calmly, respectfully, after everything that had gone unsaid, then perhaps you had reached a place they had not expected. And that raised another question: if you had found peace, would reaching out disturb it? Your soulmate suddenly became hesitant again. The third party noticed immediately. You're doing it again, they said. Your soulmate frowned. Doing what? Deciding what they feel without asking them. That sentence almost made your soulmate laugh. Because it was true. Even after all these revelations, they were still trying to protect themselves by predicting your answer. Maybe you had moved on emotionally. Maybe you were waiting. Maybe you were simply living your life with no expectation at all. Your soulmate could guess forever and never know. The only honest path was communication. That was when something inside them settled. They stopped trying to predict the future and focused instead on what they could control, the sincerity of their own words. But there was still one memory they needed to revisit first. It involved the exact day they chose to pull away. Your soulmate had always remembered that moment as a reaction to something you did. They thought you seemed distant, and they interpreted your distance as a quiet decision. Yet now, with everything the third party had revealed, they went back through the details more carefully. You had not actually said goodbye. You had not told them you wanted less connection. You had not closed the door. You had simply become quieter after your soulmate had been inconsistent for several days. Suddenly the sequence looked different. Maybe you were not creating distance. Maybe you were responding to the distance they had already created. The realization was almost startling in its simplicity. Your soulmate had believed they were reacting to you, while you may have believed you were reacting to them. Two mirrors facing each other, each reflecting the other person's hesitation until nobody remembered where the hesitation began. Your soulmate whispered, "We were both waiting." And for the first time, the thought did not feel tragic. It felt clarifying. Because if misunderstanding had created the silence, understanding could at least change what happened next. Stay till the end, because the third party then revealed one final detail from that recent moment with you, and this was the detail your soulmate could not stop thinking about. After you defended them and changed the subject, someone jokingly asked why you still spoke about your soulmate with such respect after everything had become complicated. You paused. You did not give some grand declaration. You did not reveal anything deeply private. You simply smiled and said, "Because not every unfinished story needs a villain." When your soulmate heard those words, they became completely silent. There was something almost disarming about them. You had not blamed yourself. You had not blamed them. You had simply refused to turn complexity into cruelty. Your soulmate repeated the sentence under their breath. Not every unfinished story needs a villain. The third party nodded. That was the moment your soulmate's entire emotional posture changed. Until then, they had been carrying a hidden belief that someone had to be responsible for the distance. Maybe you failed to speak. Maybe they failed to act. Maybe timing failed both of you. But your words introduced another possibility. Sometimes two people can care and still misunderstand each other. Sometimes nobody needs to be condemned for a story to remain unfinished. Sometimes maturity begins when people stop searching for someone to blame and start asking what they can understand. Your soulmate felt an unexpected sense of relief. Perhaps that was why the past had been so difficult to revisit. They assumed facing it would require admitting they had ruined everything or proving that you had. But maybe neither was necessary. Maybe they could simply say, "I wish I had understood you better." That sentence felt possible. And for the first time, reaching out did not feel like reopening an old wound. It felt like offering clarity to something that had remained incomplete. That evening, your soulmate sat somewhere quiet with the phone in their hand. They opened your conversation again. This time they did not scroll through old messages. They did not search for hidden meanings. They did not try to interpret your last words. They simply opened a new message and began writing from where they were now. "I heard something about you today that made me rethink a lot of things." They paused. Then continued. "Nothing bad. Actually, it reminded me of something I should have understood sooner. I think there were moments when I mistook your patience for distance." They read the words twice. Their heart moved strangely because the message was becoming more real with every line. "I don't know how you remember everything between us, and I don't want to assume. But I realize now that I made some assumptions instead of asking you directly." Another pause. Your soulmate almost deleted it again. The old instinct returned, the instinct to retreat before vulnerability became visible. But then they remembered the third party's question: "Are you comfortable letting them remember you through a misunderstanding?" Their fingers returned to the keyboard. "I'm not writing this to pressure you into anything. I just didn't want silence to keep speaking for me." That was the sentence. Your soulmate knew it immediately. Because silence had been speaking for both of you for far too long. It had said things neither of you consciously chose. It had said, "I don't care." It had said, "I've forgotten." It had said, "There is nothing left to explain." Yet perhaps none of those statements had ever been completely true. Your soulmate read the entire message from beginning to end. Then they noticed something unexpected. They were not shaking with fear. They were calm. Nervous, yes. Vulnerable, certainly. But calm. The message did not demand your return. It did not promise a future. It simply restored truth to a place where assumptions had been living. Their thumb hovered above send. And then a new notification appeared. Not from you. From the third party. Just one message: "There's one more thing I forgot to tell you." Your soulmate stopped immediately. They opened it. The next line made them sit completely still. When they said that unfinished stories don't need villains, someone asked whether they would ever speak to you again. Your soulmate's attention sharpened. They typed back, "What did they say?" There was a short delay. Then the answer arrived. They said they wouldn't force anything, but if you ever came to them honestly, they would listen. Your soulmate stared at those words for a long time. Not because they guaranteed anything. They did not. Listening was not a promise of reunion. It was not proof that every feeling remained unchanged. But it was an opening. A simple, grounded, human opening. And suddenly your soulmate understood something they had missed from the beginning. They had been waiting for certainty when all they really needed was enough courage to begin honestly. Their thumb returned to the unfinished message. This time, they did not delete a single word. But just before pressing send, they added one final sentence, one sentence the third party had never expected your soulmate to be ready to admit, and one that would reveal the real reason they had created distance in the first place. The words appeared slowly on the screen. "The truth is, I didn't pull away because you meant too little to me." Your soulmate paused after the final word, knowing exactly what had to come next.